Okay, I think there's a fair chunk of people in just now, and I'm imagining there'll be more people just arriving over time. So what I'll do is I'll just get us started. Jay and Adele, just as the previous ones, if you don't mind, just if I'm talking, just letting people in as they start to come online. That would be great if you could.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks, Adele. So just to welcome everyone to today's session with Julian, which again is part one of a two-part series of webinars this week, with an overall aim of supporting people to better understand the relationship between coaching research and coaching practice. I'll not do a formal introduction to Julian, as he'll do a good enough job of that himself. But what I will do is just provide a framework for what you should expect from today's session, and situate it more broadly in why we brought this session together. So for those of you on the session who may not be from the Coaching Network, this is part of a broader program of learning for developers of coaches within our system, as we begin to operationalise a new framework for coach education in Scotland. And this is, as people know, in response to our retirement of UKCC, which we did so in March of this year. So while we're now working towards a common set of principles through our framework for coach education and through our effective coaching map, we should also recognise the complexity of sports coaching, not just within any given sport, but across the system as a whole. And therefore, we need to develop the resources within our network to think more broadly about what sports coaching is and what it can be within our system. With that in mind, together we'll explore coaching through different lenses, but Julian will offer us a perspective on what that could mean, and we'll navigate these differing perspectives or disciplinary approaches to understanding sports coaching through a behavioural lens, a cognitive lens, as well as understanding coaching through the lens of social and cultural complexity. While we engage in this session, I would ask you to bring the primer that we sent out via the email to the forefront of your mind, and begin to ask yourself, could the problem or issue I've brought to the table be understood through some of the concepts we engage with today? The session itself is for 90 minutes, and we'll aim to finish in or around 3:30. But in doing so, can I ask you to mute your mics, and throughout the session, I will encourage dialogue through the chat function of the webinar. There will be natural breaks through the session where I'll invite people to engage in dialogue with Julian. So whatever questions or curiosities you may have throughout the session, please pop them in the chat box and I'll invite you in as a result. The other thing I would point is that the session is being recorded, and highlighted in the email. I did ask that this recording is not shared widely beyond yourselves, simply because there's items within it which are not yet published, and in the interest of respecting Julian's work, I would ask us just not to share that beyond ourselves and into our networks. So with that, without further ado, I'll hand over to Julian to introduce himself and bring the session on.
Thanks, Derek. Can you hear me okay, Derek? Can you just give me a thumbs up? Okay. Thanks, Derek, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you to Derek and Sport Scotland for giving me this opportunity to share my work. Really gratefully received. The work does have a more kind of philosophical, research-based dimension to it. So it's kind of quite nice, quite gratifying when policy and agencies and organisations ask for researchers like myself to present on these kind of things. But it may be philosophical, but I think it has quite important implications for practitioners, as I hope to demonstrate over the two sessions. And one of the nice things about the work, even though it's kind of published, the main body of it was published in quite a thick hardback tome, is that the practitioners have engaged with it and have said to me how much they've enjoyed reading it and how much they resonated with the work in terms of thinking about their own practice. So the work really is concerned with how we think about knowledge and how we use knowledge to solve professional and practical problems. So it's that kind of focus on the knowledge of coaching, different types of knowledge of coaching, and how research as well can be split up into different types, and how that these can all kind of help to inform our understanding. Okay, so I will move on. I've not used MS Teams in this way before, Derek, so this is all highly experimental. So who am I? I'm not two people. I'm the young handsome one that's on the left of my screen. Hopefully on the left of your screens. The other chap is a gentleman called Pat Duffy, who I'll introduce shortly. My background, I've been a academic and policy research. I was pretty much been a researcher, but initially in kind of entrepreneurship and sociological research, before moving onto the policy side as a research manager during the early stages of the lottery at UK Sport. I then moved to be head of research at UK Coaching. I also did some work for the Australian Institute of Sport. My work at Leeds Beckett is mainly kind of consultancy work with sporting organisations, though I'm increasingly doing kind of masters and PhD level teaching and supervision. I'm also a community football coach of many years, so and a lot of the research I do as well does kind of like focus into that coach development space. I've recently been appointed the director of a research centre at Leeds Beckett University, and we're calling it the Pat Duffy Research Centre for Sport Coaching, after a colleague of mine from what is now UK Coaching, what was then Sports Coach UK, Pat Duffy, a real sort of leader and inspiration for coaching change. In fact, Scotland was the site of one of the most exciting moments I think I've experienced in sport coaching policy, the 2010 summit, where there was some real momentum behind coaching, and it was really spearheaded by Pat Duffy. He was a great bloke to work with, really charming guy, really intelligent, real agent for change, advocate for sport coaching. Unfortunately, sadly, passed away in 2014. Whilst it was a colleague of mine at Leeds Beckett at that time, but his legacy lives on through the research centre, which I said I've just been asked to direct. And I raise this because what we're trying to do is not just really tell everyone about the great research that we're doing, but we also want to use the research centre to start to have a conversation about sport coaching across the different domains, the different types of coaching, the different sports. Everyone I speak to always generally makes the point that coaches are often very isolated, that they have no one to they don't really feel like they've got the networks to share ideas with, or they may be even looking at it from a research perspective, that there are individuals in specific universities who might be lone sport coaching academics. And we felt, rather than sort of like trying to put the drawbridge up and tell the world how great we were, we would start with the assumption that we'd be nice to start a conversation with everybody involved. So that's a bit about me and my role in the research centre. As I mentioned, most of my work at Leeds Beckett has been in that kind of policy and practice space. There's some of the clients we've worked with. It's generally been about understanding effective coaching, effective coach development, work also on kind of participant performer development. So every organisation has a different questions, but they're the kind of people we've been working with. So I just wanted to be clear about where I was coming from in relation to this presentation, in terms of its background, its underpinnings, and the work that I've done over the last 10, 13 years has really been a beef, excuse the pun, and the bad image, around with academics and the way that they treat their knowledge. So my work has really been addressed to researchers, saying, as researchers, are we sure we're doing as good a job as we could be for the policymakers and practitioners that applied research should surely serve. So in having that kind of conversation with researchers, it comes with a kind of researchy language to it. So I'll have to make apologies if I use terminology that's kind of sounds very researchy. If you want to put kind of things in the chat box about if there's things you want me to return to or terminology that you want me to explain, then I'm very, very happy to do that. I'll try and keep it at that kind of nice interface of it where I suspect most of you guys are, where you're sort of heavily embedded in coaching and coach development, but you've also, you may have seen the odd research article. So hopefully I'll find the right level. Yeah, so my beef has been with the researchers with a view to try and make researchers think much more about policy and practitioners. But of course, you have to deal with the researchers first. There's some published work associated with this. I think I first came to critical realism, which I'll explain a little bit about very briefly in the second session on Friday, in about 2007, 8, I think, and I think it took about 10 years from my first reading of it to get the book published, which is the blue thing in the middle. But there was some published work in 2013, and some work in between as well on benchmarking coach education. 2016, I think that was. I think Derek shared one of those articles with you. So that's the kind of the published work associated with this area at the moment. There's plenty more to come from both myself and from some of my PhD students. This is not the only work I'm doing for Sport Scotland. We're also doing some work evaluating a Sport Scotland programme on high performance coach developers. And one of the interesting facets of that programme has been its presentation of an alternative model of education, shall we say, and of learning, development and education, one that really is situated in everyday practice through social learning, through people talking to each other, and a real reluctance to share content in that traditional classroom manner. And I'm very conscious that philosophy really in these days, particularly within our university, with our kind of postgraduate programs, that's a philosophy that we really try to use in the classroom as well. We try to make sessions much more discursive around problems, encourage people to share their experiences. And I'm dead conscious that in 2020, and given the COVID conditions, that that's not really possible in a session like this, and that I'll have to talk quite a lot and have to share informations, and there's a PowerPoint with like words on it. So it's not the ideal situation. If we could imagine an alternative delivery mode in a COVID environment, it would be great to do that, but it seems this is what we've got at the moment. So there will be a lot of me talking, sadly, and I won't be able to get a sense of where you guys are coming from, but there is the chat box if you have a comment, a question, or you want to share anything. Okay, so to the title of the presentation, exploring coaching using different lenses, disciplinary perspectives on sport coaching, and I'm just going to share this text with you. So I think there's sometimes a sense from researchers, and maybe from others as well, that researchers know best, and because researchers know a lot of things. But if you think about it for a second, research, particularly in sport, has two problems. That research is really a social activity, which makes it really, really very, very complex. And also there's not a lot of money for sport researchers to exist. So there's not many of us doing that much work. So we have this problem where we have quite a few researchers, only a small number of researchers, sorry, trying to capture something that's very, very complex. So it's impossible to capture all that complexity of sport coaching. So you have to make decisions about what things you look at and in what ways. So that's really what I kind of want to get into for this session is looking at the kind of decisions that researchers have made about what they look at in what ways. But there's always this idea there that it's always a job, an unfinished job, that there's always much more work to do. And so if you were one of those people who thought of research as kind of having a particular status, a particular standing, now, and I speak as an academic researcher, I would encourage you to think of it as offering something that's much more kind of humble in relation to other ways of thinking about sport coaching, other knowledge types, which I'll come on to. So with the limited resources, sport coaching researchers have generally looked at sport coaching in particular ways, as I've said, through particular lenses, and those lenses, if you put on one set of lenses, the way you look at something will change if you put on a different set of lenses. And these lenses in sport coaching are generally corralled through disciplines, and notably through psychology and sociology. And there are some fine grains of those two positions, but they're the main two positions. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Because, again, sport coaching is a social activity. And when we do research on relationships, the social dimensions of activities, we generally use kind of psychology and sociology. They're the main disciplines. You might say anthropology, economics, kind of, and the kind of higher level social sciences do those jobs as well. But in sport coaching, it's mainly psychology and sociology. So the aims of the session, this is the old school formal, let's get the aims and purposes out of the way. So the aim of the session to explore what research is. So it's just continuing the points I've just making there about to try and kind of deal with a few misconceptions. To understand that research just offers particular perspectives, frames or lenses, to talk through what those perspective frames or lenses are, and start to explore what this means for our using of research to understand and explain practice. Hopefully that's fairly clear. And the order of play then is looking back and placing research amongst a number of knowledge types, introducing some research tools which I'm hoping you find useful for thinking about research in relation to understanding what research is and how you can use research. And then introducing the three main positions which I've described as functional, behavioural, cognitive, and social and complexity perspectives. So that's what we'll go through. When Derek and I spoke last Friday about the presentation, he said, is there some way in which you could orientate the guys towards thinking about particular questions that then they could sort of cross-check against some of the things I was talking about. And that I found during the kind of postgrad level teaching that just getting coaches or students to focus on particular problems of issues, really notably significant ones that have created some emotional and cognitive dissonance for you, might be a good way of framing some of the stuff I'm saying, when I'm introducing particular positions, say how does that, what Jay's saying about particular knowledge type or research position, how does that intersect with the kind of problems I've been experiencing? So if you can bear that in mind, I don't think, unfortunately, this is one of those sad situations again with the kind of the way we're doing this, but those kind of things can't be easily shared across the group, but just keep those in mind. Derek, I hope that's enough in terms of teeing up those questions and teeing up the email that you sent through. I don't really see how we can do it any other way.
No, what I will point out at this stage, Julian, I've had a couple of emails from delegates to say that there's no chat box function for some of the people who are external. And what I will point them to is the hand up function. If they've got a question, they can use the hand up function throughout, and what I'll do is I'll go through those who have their hands up to address some questions or curiosities they may have for you. Back to the old school. We're back at school, and stick your hand up if you've got a question.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the first kind of little mini section of of today's presentation is then how can we think about and place research, and this is the point about how can we place research about coaching research amongst a number of other knowledge types and think about its place. So apologies for the kind of crude graphics. My colleague Bob Muir does some absolutely fantastic presentations with very, very elaborate graphics. I tend to be a master of just pulling things together from Google Images and just dumping them on top of each other. So you'll see some fairly crude images over the two sessions, but hopefully they're fit for purpose in terms of actually, getting you to think about what it is I would like us to think about and talk about. So Planet Sport Coaching, this is what we're all interested in. You guys as coach developers are obviously interested in working with coaches and facilitating their development, helping them to think about their development and working with them. And likewise, us guys as academics with in our teaching roles and also our research roles. And a really, really important question, I think, for all of us is how do we, as individuals, as coach developers, sport coaches, learn about this thing, Planet Sport Coaching? And if you look at the research on learning, on sport coaching learning, you see reams and reams of information. And if you look at the broader learning literature, obviously there's like hundreds of years of study of learning. So there's like lots to be said about learning, but I think basically it can be broken down to two things. And that is we learn through our experiences, and you'll note there that there's a kind of underline on the S, because experience doesn't just mean engaging in a practical task like coaching or coach development. It means experiences like this one, like us, like myself talking today, or you guys having a conversation. So experiences incorporates lots of different things. It's not just doing things. And then some kind of conscious reflection on those experiences. So broadly speaking, across most learning theories, those are the kind of two main things that come out. And so who has those experiences? Who does that reflecting on sport coaching? That's the you, the me, the us, the we. And that is through that practical engagement in tasks, is through interaction with others and other ideas. Can't really see that on my screen because of all of the but I'm guessing under all the stuff that's sticking up there, it's through the groups and through us having conversations with each other. So often if you speak to coaches about how they learn and who they learn from, they will often say not from governing body programs, but through just talking through to other coaches in their particular context. So it's through having those conversations that we check and challenge our ideas about sport coaching. And then, of course, there's the good old fashioned NGB, governing body agency program, which is not so old fashioned anymore. I think that's really moved on a lot in the last 10 years, in particular embracing different kind of andragogical educational approaches. But it's a source of learning, and those who've been on the coach education course, I think most people say they're not quite as bad as certain sections of the research literature would tell you, though of course it varies from course to course. As coaches and coach developers as well, we also learn from other, particularly in kind of like the performance and high performance domain, where these kind of people are around, but applied disciplinary professionals, multidisciplinary teams, they're a really important source of knowledge for us. And then finally, from the researchers. And from the work I've done with coaches, you'll find that many coaches, particularly again in the performance and high performance domain, I guess you guys are interested in working with, will engage with research, but might not engage with research articles, but might engage with kind of summaries on YouTube or through popular science books. So the first image there is of Carol Dweck, and I know that the book The Growth Mindset's been read by a lot of people. Steve Peters' book has been read as well. Chimp Paradox, is it? And then we've got the academics as well. I wouldn't want to put myself in such esteemed company as some of the characters up there, the John Lyles, the Robin Joneses, Thelma Horns, even our own Andrea Abraham, but it's because you've asked me to talk over the 2 sessions about critical realism. I dared to put my image up there. But the point is that there are lots of different ways of learning about and starting to know sport coaching. And in the paper I'm just kind of developing, it's nearly finished now, I've just tried to think about, just kind of more formally conceptualize those different ways of knowing. So if you look at the diagram, it's got the individual in the middle there, the individual and their personal experiential knowledge, and moving through the different layers of a kind of a embedded system, an embedded ecology, moving out from the individuals to groups to the organizations they work in to the broader socio-cultural environment. Those layers are all associated with different types of knowledge, and they all kind of reflect the 5 knowledge types I've just gone through. Some of that knowledge is conscious and explicit, some of it's tacit and non-conscious, and I suppose it's just being aware that we can kind of have knowledge about things but not often be aware of it. It's an important way of understanding knowledge types in sport coaching. So some thoughts on what I've just said. There are lots of different types of knowledge, sources of learning about sport coaching. I'm sure you all recognise those. They all influence, borrow, seep from, and leak into each other. You learn from others, they learn from you. They read research, you read research. Educators have experience of coaching, they read research. They talk to each other, people forget things, people remember things, and it's all a very complex, intertwined picture. So, for example, if you, a job that may be given to someone like myself, can you evaluate how much knowledge or how much someone's practice has changed as a result of a particular program? You're always up against the fact that when people come to a program, they bring lots of experiences and knowledge with them, and disentangling that is really difficult. But we just have to, it's just the way it is, and we just have to live with that and accept it and encourage it, in fact. But it also means that sometimes people are either influenced by ideas from areas, for example, from research, that they may not recognise that they're being influenced by. So a coach may talk to another coach, a coach developer may talk to another coach developer, and they may say, "Oh, I've had some really good thinking," but the second coach might not necessarily realise that that's come from research or from a governing body or whatever. So there's a kind of an issue with attribution, but again, that's just the way the world is. Some will tell you that their knowledge type is better than others. There is a politics to knowledge. So this will come as no surprise, again, to many of you guys. If you're in a particular coaching community or a coach development community, you might object to the way that a program's been put together by an agency or a governing body. Agencies and governing bodies may think that they're in a better position to capture knowledge about coaching than academics. And academics likewise might think that they're in a better position to capture coaching because of the way in which they go about collecting information, the process and methodologies they use about capturing that information. So there is always this politics of knowledge. There's always this tension between the different knowledge types. And again, it's just something we kind of have to live with and manage. And I think managing that through a little bit of humility does no one no harm at all. But I think it's also important to say that these knowledge types do different types of work. So your personal experiential knowledge will do lots of work to fill in the gaps that aren't covered by existing research or by a governing body programme, and your conversations with other people will also help to fill those gaps. So research is just one type of knowledge. I hope that's fairly clear. Okay. Whoops, 1 second, Derek, I'll just get my screen back on.
Jay, I'm wondering, is this a good point to just start inviting in some questions before we start to watching good coaches?
Well, I'm just trying to find where I put my just lost the screen, Derek, unfortunately.
We can still see it up here.
Yeah.
There we go. Yeah. We're now on my screen. You're sharing the full screen.
Okay. Sorry.
So if you can, just while we invite questions in, you can perhaps
try and figure it out.
Well, if we start the same process again and go back into the share tray and start uploading the.
Yeah, I'll do that.
It should actually be in there. Yeah, and then we can take it from there. So I'm just wondering if anybody feel free to unmute and ask Jay a question on that last section. Please do so. I'll make
any observations. Let's put it like this. Did I share with you then anything that you didn't know already? Is this the way that you understood the world, or were there those who actually did put research on a bit of a pedestal?
I suppose that I would probably actually goes back to your point around different types of knowledge and different things. And obviously, when we consider the paper that you shared, and we talk about some of the working of Cote and Gilbert, perhaps more normative approaches to understanding sports coaching, that might lend itself to a very simplistic view of what coaches should do, versus more complex approaches around perhaps when somebody's developing a level of sophistication around their coaching. That research approach might help them understand that a little bit better. So I'm just wondering where within that spectrum might we consider how we would use specific approaches with specific types of coaches relative to their learning journey from say naive or novice to sophisticated and master coach.
Yeah, I mean, Derek, I think that's a really, really good question. But I think, if you don't mind, I'd like to keep the powder dry on that one, because I think that's something that comes out on the next stages of the presentation. So I can really answer that question, I think, more by progressing on the presentation.
Perfect. At this point, then I'll invite Stuart Wilkinson in to ask his question.
Hi, Julian. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yes, Stuart.
Yeah. Thanks for today. This is really interesting. I'm a bit where I'm stuck at the moment. It's probably like my dispositions on views on particular things. Obviously, like when you start to discuss something as dynamic as coaching, you need to do, quite a lot of prolific reading across the board, don't you? And some things come really easy for you. You can absorb it, question about it, plan, and you have some independence to how you access your knowledge. And then there's other stuff that, because of your disposition, like one man's meat is another man's poison. It becomes pretty difficult to notice and distill it and get some empathy in and around it. So I've always looked for some information or research on knowledge and dispositions and that affects, and how our bias affects all that. So it's interesting because you are talking about, it is really personal, based on our growth as coaches and what we read and what influences. But there is, I honestly really believe, and when I'm even trying to develop coaches myself, there's things that they stay clear of that they really need to get a grip of for different reasons. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense, yeah. Well, I hope it does. The way that the read I've taken on it is that if I can just use a framework I've offered to sort of frame that question, is that there are lots of different sources of knowledge that coaches and coach developers could draw on, but there's some individuals maybe really embrace those different types of knowledge, but others are much more reluctant to think, for example, beyond their experience, or just chatting with their mates who they know are coaches and so on. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, it's even reading journals. It's you know, and you started at the beginning apologising for some of the vocabulary that you might use, and then obviously, you know, because of dispositions, and you know, you know, a lot of coaches can be voluntary, can't they, and grassroots can be bricklayers to solicitors. So it's that influences, or our understanding of it, that influences, you know, because of our dispositions, our personalities, that affects learning for coaches.
I couldn't agree more. I think individuals, I think that's one of the nettles that coach educators and developers really have to grasp, particularly if you talk about programs development, about how you can reflect individual differences. I think if you're doing one-to-one coach development work and you're a fairly experienced coach developer, then of course dealing with individual differences is second nature. But it sometimes can be difficult, I would imagine. I don't know who you work with, Stuart, to get some people to embrace other types of knowledge to what they're used to. I don't have a magic bullet for that one, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it's like I've got a strange experience at the moment, because I'm working in Eastern Europe, developing coaches and athletes, and I deliver on the coaching degree at the University of Central Lancashire. So I have to share words and dialogue that's important for students, and then I have to tell the same story on a field in a different way to coaches, and it's broad and it's challenging. But the biggest thing of all is trying to get a grips of people that are in front of you, the dispositions and the views on things. I think it's a really, really difficult one to break down. And yeah, you're right. When we start to work as tutors with students, and you get them on one-on-one, you get a feel for how they view things. But to the masses, or for large groups, it's really, really difficult to understand how, you know, am I actually putting them off coaching here, or am I engaging and interested in the research?
Yeah, I mean, an interesting side of that for me is language, and how individuals use language, and it's again for me a bit of a drawbridge up and a drawbridge down approach. So, well, there's 2 points to be made there. I think we've all been in meetings, long meetings, you know, 2-3 hours, and you realise after 1.5 hours that the meeting hasn't progressed because everybody is using different language to describe the same thing, and everybody wants their language to be used. So there's like a battle of language happens, I think, in most relationships, in most groups.
Tell me if I'm right here then, Julian. I mean, and I won't take any more of your time, I promise. I look for meta learning. So if they're starting to dig under the fabric of the knowledge and wanting to know more information, I think I've cracked it. Is it probably a good benchmark?
Sorry, you'll have to give me a little more there.
Like you get metacognition, so you look at that for that meta learning, are they getting underneath the fabric of the research and asking deeper questions? So that's my own benchmark. Oh, right, they've asked a challenging question, or they've took it on a journey. So I sort of use that to know that I've sort of ticked a box and it's starting to work for them.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I will actually talk to that, Stuart, shortly. So if you don't mind, I'll come back to that question if it's fine. I think the other thing though about the language issue for me is just about, again, how you could say it's like a broader problem in society, like in the US, for example, how Democrats and Republicans are becoming increasingly separated from each other. And and you might see that in terms of like the Brexit debate in the UK. It's almost as if groups with a particular viewpoint or particular disposition are hardening in the way that they treat and treat alternative viewpoints, alternative realities, and I just don't think that's healthy for democracy, for sport coaching, for anybody, for social practice. And it's almost as if we have to sort of do our best to make ourselves understand, but also to listen to other ways of thinking about the world, other arguments, and we're in all kinds of different ways, in my view, and from what I've read, we're not going to make progress unless we start to do that.
Yeah, I think, to be fair on that, I don't think social media helps either. I think it's because it's short and snappy and they get straight to the point and possibly look for conflict as well with the biased opinions that they have. So I think it polarizes everything that we do, social media. And I wish they were all on here listening to this.
Yeah.
All right, I won't take up any more of your time. Thanks for that, Julian.
Thanks for your question. Thank you.
It's interesting that Jay's talking about the Democrats and Republicans in the States, when we could be talking about those of an ecological or cognitive disposition within sports coaching, but that's by the by. I'll invite you to move on, Julian, if that's okay. We've got about 45 minutes left.
Right, better get moving then. Okay, so now I just want to introduce. So we've placed research within a broader set of knowledge types. Now I want to introduce some thinking tools for how we can look at research, which I'm kind of hoping might be quite helpful when we come to actually look at the kind of specific disciplinary positions. So we're very much now in the research terrain. So any mountaineers out there, Leslie? I think this is Mount Everest. It looks like Mount Everest to me, from my crude lay understanding of Everest. But in that valley right at the bottom, just imagine there's some sport going on, and there's some sport coaching going on. There's some handball, there's some rugby, there's some Gaelic football, whatever. And we as researchers then want to go and watch that sporting activity and that coaching occur. So we're going to get into that valley and we're going to experience the field. And that's really at the kind of like the dirty end of research, if you like, or the nice end of research. I like to think of it when you're out there watching people, observing people, asking people questions. So that's obviously clearly an important part of the research process. But when we do research, we don't just want to sort of like tell everybody about all those kind of really, really complex experiences and how they panned out over a 1 hour, 2 hour, 4 hour, 10-day experience, because that would just be giving loads of people lots of raw, kind of unfiltered data that they could just see if they went and watched the sport coaching themselves in that particular context. With research, you're always trying to say something more than what the data gives you. You want to pull out the bare bones. What are the real patterns in this data, and why do those patterns occur, such that I can share what I found with others. So the level above data collection, if you like, is trying to describe patterns and find explanations for those patterns in specific contexts. In this instance, it might be a game of handball at the base of Mount Everest. But in some way, by developing those findings, you've reduced the data in some way. You're not telling everybody about everything. You're starting to develop some kind of higher level findings. higher up the mountain, as we climb higher and higher up, if you do enough research about specific contexts, then you can start to say something even more general about individuals, individual coaches, for example, or groups of coaches. It might be, you might say something about community coaches or high performance coaches or the organizations they work with and the societies. It's a higher level of generality, it's a higher level of abstraction. It's still saying useful things about kind of higher level properties of individuals and societies. So a good example of that, I don't know if there are any sociologists out there, is sociologists often use this distinction between individual and society, or agency and structure. What are individuals generally like? Are they kind of goal seeking, for example? What are societies like? Are they generally enabling or constraining, for example? Are organizations enabling and constraining? So the further you move up the mountain, the more kind of abstract and general the research findings become. And then finally, there's this kind of final level, which is trying to understand and think about how the world is structured at some fundamental level, and how we can know that world, and are there different ways of knowing. So that is a really high level kind of abstraction about how we think about research. So the first level, going back to the kind of floor of the valley, if you like, underneath Everest, is the data collection and the different methodologies for collecting data. Then if we're talking about research from particular contexts, we generally talk about the idea of middle range theory. Above that is what we call general theory, when it's about higher level, more abstract things about individuals, groups, societies. And then the top level is what we would call meta theory. Meta, I'm sure most of you know, meta just means beyond theory. It's going beyond our general and our middle range theories about the world. It's saying things about how the world's structured and how we can know the world. Some of you recognise the terms, I'm sure, ontology and epistemology. Ontology, how is the world structured? Epistemology, how can we know the world? But in effect, by moving up that kind of mountain, you are giving yourself the tools to look further down the mountain. So by making decisions about meta theory, it gives you the tools to do general theory, and general theory then gives you tools to do middle range theory, and middle range theory might be a way of setting up some data collection. So you kind of go up and down the mountain depending on what way you're looking at it in terms of different levels of research or theory or data. So I hope that makes sense. From a sport coaching point of view, so we have these different levels of theory, then we can see that there are different levels of contribution within the sport coaching research literature. So it's very rare that you will just get a data paper published in an academic journal. Most people generally attach some data to some theory, some middle range theory, and a smaller number of papers talk about offer a general theory, and in terms of, for example, and we come on to this, general theoretical idea is sport coaching behavioural, cognitive or social, and meta-theoretical in terms of taking the theoretical ideas in sport coaching into philosophy. Not very few kind of people have done that. And these are just some example references of each level. So what you'll find is that if you read the research, almost all of it will be at that middle range level. So someone will have collected some data in, to use the example cited here, decision making in French sailing, or troubles between athletes and between players and coaches in English academy football. So it's always kind of findings in a particular context. Then you will find kind of papers, fewer papers at that general theory level, which say, for example, as Abraham and Collins did in 1998, that, what we shouldn't think of sport coaching as behavioural anymore. We should think of it as cognitive. Jones in 2000 well, we should also think of it as being social, and Bowes and Jones in 2016, we should think of it as complex. So they're kind of shifting the goalposts a bit, but then you've got others, and I have attempted to be one who've tried to move to that meta-theoretical level, who've kind of made claims for actually how the whole of the sport coaching discipline should be organised at that kind of philosophical level. And I've advocated a kind of interdisciplinary critical realist approach. And then you've got people like Andy and Dave Collins who've said, yeah, we do have these positions, all these different positions on sport coaching, but if you just put yourself in the mind of the coach, it's possible to think of sport coaching totally exclusively from a psychological point of view. And then Jones in 2016 said, well, I think we can bring all of the discipline together and all its disparate parts together through a more social complexity view. So I hope that makes sense in terms of the different levels of theory, because that's quite important in terms of understanding how the disciplines are placed and how you can use different levels of theory to think about what disciplines are. And it also, I think, encourages a mindset of thinking about different levels, which comes into something I think Stuart mentioned earlier on about how you just kind of you get people to think deeper, to peel back the layers of the onion, if you like. So depending on how you look at it, moving up the mountains, almost peeling back the layers of the onion till you get to the core. Okay, I hope that's okay. So they're some of the thinking tools I've introduced to try and help us situate the different disciplinary lenses in sport coaching research, which I will now go through. So I think there's probably 5 main positions. In many ways, it depends how you bring them together, but this is a way I've chosen to do it. So the behavioural and functional perspective, watching good coaches and sharing what's seen. The cognitive perspective, exploring how coaches think and make decisions. Social and complexity perspective, exploring the coaching context. Normative perspectives, which is how coaching should be rather than what it is. What should coaches be doing? Should they be educators, for example? And then inter and multidisciplinary perspectives, and that will be very much the feature of the second session on Friday. So these are some of the main perspectives, and now I'm going to quickly, within the time available, go through those 3 perspectives. Derek, are we okay there, or
yeah, no.
keep going?
Keep going if you wish, unless anybody's got any questions. I was going to ask just one very brief question around. You spoke about tension and politics in terms of knowledge. Does the tension dissipate the higher up the mountain you go, or does it become, or is there more tension the nearer you get to meta theory?
That is a absolutely fantastic question. I think the tensions are actually in sport coaching historically have been at the general theory level, and people generally use this. So this is tensions between academics, and there are tensions between academics, absolutely. Probably more than maybe more than what I've had someone say to me recently. I would listen to academics more if they weren't always arguing with each other and contradicting each other so much. So I think the arguments have generally been over the past decade at the general theory level, but they usually use middle range theory, the middle range data as ammunition for their particular points. But in moving to that meta-theoretical level, the kind of the Abrams, Collins, Jones of the world, and indeed myself, have tried to say, well, here's one way of resolving those tensions, but it just so happens that we all try to resolve them in different ways. But actually, you see more of an olive branch to different positions at the meta-theoretical level than you do at the general theory level. Okay, Derek, I did warn you this might be a 2-hour job, so I will have to speed up. So some thoughts very quickly on this section. We have seen lots of different types of sport coaching knowledge. Hopefully that's clear. We have started to explore the idea that there are different ways of knowing sport coaching and through research. Given the format of what we're doing today, a rhetorical question: why are there so many coaching knowledges? Not just coaching knowledge, coaching knowledges. Because coaching is so complex, diverse, and difficult. This word equifinality, there's more than one way of doing the same job. So if there's lots of different ways of doing it, then you would expect lots of different knowledges to contribute that. But also this idea of limited resource, that not everyone can know everything. It's impossible for me, for example, to say anything about your coaching or your coach development because only you know your context. I think my job as a researcher is to give people tools to think about their coaching and coach development. It's in the tool development where the academics can contribute, but not be experts in tool development rather than experts in coaching, if that makes sense. But, and this is important, is that it might be complex and difficult sport coaching, but it's not impossible to describe and explain and indeed do well. There are some within the research literature who almost like describes sport coaching as like unmanageably complex. That it's why bother even trying to help people? It's so complex. And I would really want us to get away from that way of thinking, because I think research really can help us, but think of it in terms of the different levels I've described in the ways in which it can help. And this links to kind of Sean's idea of questioning assumptions, and it comes back to Stuart's points, is how do we move people through the different levels? So how, if we're going up the mountain, it is a metaphor for getting them to think deeper and deeper. How can they move beyond the single loop thing? The idea, for example, I'm a coach, and I think of sport coaching as being exclusive behavioural, and it's just about how good my session structures and my session activities are, and am I doing the right session activities? Am I doing the right thing? There's an answer out there, am I doing the right thing? To getting them to think, well, not only am I doing the right thing within the realm I'm interested in, but is there other things I could be doing, and what do I prioritize? And then the third level is then how do I decide which things are right in the first place? So it's always about moving up that mountain, peeling back the layers of the onion in this kind of action, reasoning, or experience and reflection. We talked about it in terms of learning earlier cycle. And I'm guessing that most of your work as coach developers is really in that loop of just trying to get at the assumptions that underpin behaviours. And I would suggest that research can give you some tools to facilitate that. Okay, behavioural functional perspectives, watching good coaches coach and sharing what is seen. The history of this actually dates back to the 1970s, 1974 in fact, an attempt by Tharp and Gallimore to capture the behaviours of coaching legend, basketball coach legend John Wooden, and they were seen really as being the kind of pioneers of this idea of a science of sport coaching, which was really embraced in North America. The North Americans are very kind of scientifically orientated, probably more than the UK and Europe. And so it was them who really took it on. Most of these researchers operated in the 70s and 80s. They were mainly North American colleges. They would work out who the best coaches are, and they would just go and watch them coach, and they would take clipboards and they would say, well, what kind of behaviours are these good coaches using? And this tradition is actually still going strong, and you can see it as a kind of diagnostic tool in the work of Chris Cushion, his Case. Those of you who come across Case, I think John Cote did some work for you guys, Derek, before. I think you could see transformational leadership within that tradition, within a behavioural tradition. And from a kind of policy point of view, the International Sport Coaching Framework, as I'll share with shortly, also kind of offers behaviours for organisations, if you like, and behaviours for coaches. What is it? Like I said, it's about watching really what good coaches do, observation. So you'll have an observer, or you'll ask good coaches what they do, and they just say, well, what do you do when you're coaching? And it's generally sort of tied together with a bit of psychological theory, and it kind of then that brings us to this idea that good coaches do this and that. So if you want to be a good coach, you should do this and that. So it moves very quickly from describing what coaches do, to what coaches should do. And this could provide a basis for coach development curriculum. So as someone's been involved through the kind of coaching organisations for the last 10 years or so, the extent to which behavioural research has been very explicitly brought into coaching curriculum, I think, is varied a lot in the UK. And you might say UKCC, when it was worked through, just really stopped governing bodies thinking just about the kind of sporting knowledge, and got them to think a little bit more about pedagogy and so on. But it has been influential, but not as influential as some people would have you believe, I would say, in terms of coach education. What does it say? It gives you an idea of what coaches think about it at a broad level. So I would call this kind of the strategies perspective, the behavioural functional approach. So we can recognise some key things that coaches do there: setting the vision and strategy, shaping the environment, building relationships, conducting practices, and so on. Again, you will have to reflect on the coaches that you work with, but I think most coaches think they're doing a good job when they put on a good practice. How many think about the relationships that they are building, how they're shaping a broader environment, say, for example, in a community setting, a nurturing environment, or even in a high performance setting, how much care are they showing their athletes? So that kind of behavioural research gives you that high level view of the kind of high level components of what coaching is. But the behavioural research mainly is focused on two things, which has been setting up the environment, and particularly the advocacy of positive behaviours. So the carrot, not the stick, democracy, leadership, being autonomy supportive, using praise rather than criticism. A lot of the research really just focuses on building positive environments. And the other side then has been kind of really getting into the nitty-gritty of setting of sessions, organising, managing trainings. What's been a balance between skill-based and more authentic practice types, and how much are you using instruction and questioning and observation and feedback? What's a balance between those kind of more coaching behaviours side of things? And different research within those traditions might emphasise different balances. So they're the main recommendations from that perspective. And I suppose, just going back, these could be tools that you could use to work with your coaches, to ask questions about them. What is it that they are focusing on? And if they are focusing on particular things, in what ways are they focusing about those things? The criticism is that the behavioural approach offers a very superficial understanding of coaching. So coaching, if you just think of coaching as being what's observed or indeed reported by people, you're really just looking at the top of the iceberg. You're not seeing what's going on underneath. You're not asking people to describe what they're thinking. You're not reporting on those non-conscious elements of coaching. You're just looking at what you can see. And it also generally tends to strip away context. So if you do some behavioural research, say in tennis, in a performance setting, that's then generalised to apply to all coaches. It's often generalised in that way. To be fair, the behavioural orientated researchers got better as they went along. They started to recognise that there were differences, but the early research was really trying to create this one model of coaching, if you like. So this, if you think about there just being a one model view of coaching, then from a coach development point of view, it presents a very absolutist picture, very almost, and if you put that in a coach development context, it's saying there's really is one way of coaching, and if you're not doing it in that way, you're not doing it right. So it's quite a controlling way of thinking, and that's the way it's kind of generally been criticised in the literature. But I'm coming back to this point about the politics between knowledges and the politics between academics. When we offer criticism, there's a temptation to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Say, well, okay, so that there are problems with this position, the behavioural approach, so we should just move on to another approach. But I would say, well, is that being fair? And those of you who have been introduced to the work of my colleague Bob Muir and his planning and reflective framework has been a very, very useful tool. I know some of the Scottish colleagues have been using this in their coach development work. It's a very subtle and nuanced tool in the way that Bob and colleagues have been using it. But of course, there are elements in there, in the learning activities, the coach behaviours, which have been really a central concern of the behavioural tradition. So they, of course, can say something interesting about those components of coaching, but it's just there's more to coaching, there's more to say about it. So you don't try not to throw the baby out of the bathwater. The behavioural tradition still has a lot to offer, and of course it would, because Derek's a sensible chap, and he wouldn't have brought Jean Coté in if he didn't think that those ideas weren't useful. Derek, shall I continue on going through the positions, and we can have just a bit of a reflect when I get to the end of those, or shall we have a break? Or
I think just in the interests of time, just if we go through the perspectives, and then people will have a richer view to be able to form a richer question, if that makes sense.
Okay. So I think the cognitive perspective, particularly through the work of and my colleague Andy Abraham, 1988 in particular, contrasted the cognitive position against the behavioural position, notably in terms of coach education. So Andy really did, in his early work, I mean, this is a long time ago now, to be fair to him, like many good academics do, try to contrast the good parts of his position against the bad parts of the other positions. So the cognitive approach is really kind of like seeing a kind of a more of a move in the direction of a greater sophistication, if you like. It's involved. These are the kind of contributors: the Nashers, Collins, Dave Collins, John Lyle also was a very, very early user of a kind of more cognitive approach. Coté, 1995, was an early adopter of this kind of approach. An interesting part of this has been there hasn't been a great deal of research done using this approach. You really struggle to find kind of research with empirical data or data about coaches in there, but it's been really, really influential on the way that people of agencies and governing bodies have thought about coach education and development. So it's been, you could argue that it's been more influential as a position, maybe because it's quite intuitive to people, than its data and its evidence justifies. And an example of that, so this is a picture from the English FA down at St George's Park. This is who, how, what model really has come through the work that we've developed based on his initial work, Leeds Beckett. And it might have not had the empirical backing, but it's been used to kind of almost effectively design the coach education philosophy of Great Britain's biggest governing body. So it seems to have that kind of intuitive, people seem to have a strong intuition about this kind of work area, respective the data collected. What is it? It's mainly talking to expert coaches, and experts might be defined in various ways. For cognitive research, this expert novice continuum is very important, but experts might be 10 years deliberate practice, or 20 years, or at level 4, or acknowledged by their peers as being experts. And you talk to those coaches and you say, what do you know? How do you make decisions? And you kind of use this information then to think about how best to develop coaches' knowledge and their decision-making practices. So I can't see that on my slide because of the way that it's worked, but I'm assuming it says something about how the kind of psychological positions being used then to develop those interventions. So, for example, if you look across the research that I did in my book, across the psychological research, you will see lots of different types of knowledge attributed to coaches about their coaching. So they have a knowledge of sport, about learning, planning a process, about their athletes and their development, about their social context, about themselves. So there seem to be 6 main knowledge types. And if you look at, say, Jean Cotte's work, that's generally broken down to professional, and interpersonal knowledge. So again, I think this is a useful tool if you're working with coaches, thinking, well, when I'm dealing with that coach, what kind of knowledge am I really dealing with? Is it a problem with their self and their understanding, or is it a problem of their knowledge of the social context and how they interact with others? Is it a problem with their understanding of the child and or the adolescent or the adult and their development processes, or has it something to do with the sport, or what kind of practice structure you use? So these are just tools. Another tool is coming from the cognitive position, and it talks to really, I'm sure many of you are aware of this, based on the kind of popular science book, Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman, that there are different ways of thinking. The elephant and the rider, the thinking fast, the intuitive non-conscious system, the older system, is the old elephant that just plows on. The newer, more conscious, deliberative system is the rider that sometimes slowly can steer the elephant around and sometimes not. And so these provide kind of metaphors, ideas for thinking about how individuals make decisions, which system is influencing which system's in charge, and as educators, how can you engage with those different systems? And if you're dealing with, and so I think that coach education really has been a case of has been steered by recognition of these different systems. I'd love to spend more time on this slide, but I'm really conscious to the need to move on. So the criticisms, again, I suppose just to reiterate the point there, then, that again, these are the knowledge bases and the understanding of individuals being composed of 2 different almost decision-making systems are tools that have been used, tools that you can use, but tools that have been used to shape coach development and education. Criticisms. So, of course, we're moving now, I guess, from the psychologists to the sociologists, and the psychologists have dealt with the behaviour and the cognitive perspectives, and the sociologists, it's their job to criticise, really. It's one of their main tasks, and so sociologists, apologies to any sociologists in there if I've mischaracterised you, but this is just my understanding of the way that sociology has generally worked, rather than maybe how it's intended to work, but it's engaged in quite a widespread attack on all things mainstream or institutional or psychological. So no individual researcher outside sociology has been spared, no governing body, no agency has been spared. And I think some of this critique is fair and much needed, but some of it is probably a little bit unfair. I think there's been some attacks on coach education that have been unfair and potentially even damaging. What I think is fair is that cognitive approaches have been very focused on the individual's brain. It's a reduction of the individual to the brain, to knowledge, to thought processes, whereas we're not just our brains, are we? We're brains and bodies, and we're brains and bodies situated in social environments. And so there's that under examination as well, I think, of the social dimensions of coaching. So you don't get many, in cognitive approaches, you don't get many descriptions of what coaching is like to coach, the descriptions of practice. You just get kind of like this reduction to these kind of the cognitive elements of knowledge and the decision making. But there's always a but with all of these positions, the criticisms, but of course cognitive psychology may not embrace social complexity, but it certainly gives individuals, coaches, coach developers tools to think about social complexity. They're not the same thing. Thinking tools to think about social complexity can be very, very useful, whilst at the same time the cognitivists haven't done a particularly good job at collecting that or researching that social complexity, but they would probably say that that's not their job, that's the job of the sociologists. So it's this baby in the bathwater thing. Just because it's been criticised doesn't mean to say that it doesn't provide us with lots of useful tools and ideas. And there's some of the tools that I've talked about through the cognitive position. Finally, social and complexity perspectives, exploring the coach, athlete, and others in complex and difficult social contexts. The history of this, I think the way I understand it is that you could really, I'm sure there are odd papers here and there earlier than this, but really I think as a tradition you can trace it back to the work of Robin Jones and Paul Potracca around about 1999-2000, who said, hang on a minute, sport coaching is a social activity. It's full of relationships. Why is no one really talking about relationships and the difficulties inherent in those relationships? And it's a kind of a position then that's being taken on. It's an interesting one with the sociological perspective. If you read a sociological paper, there's always this sense that they are outsiders. They're the outsiders telling the mainstream that they need to get real about what coaching is. But actually, from a UK perspective in particular, most researchers, most active researchers adopt a sociological position. So the outsiders are really probably the insiders, and have actually probably had as much influence on anybody on the way that coach education has evolved over the last 10 years. This work has lots of kind of conceptual work behind it, has lots of empirical work behind it, and it's associated with a particular journal and a particular conference, a CRIC conference. So it's a kind of vibrant area of activity. As I've said, what is it? It's a statement of the importance of the social and relational sport coaching. It's about understanding individuals and groups and their interactions. In terms of actually how they collect information, it's a tendency towards more the kind of qualitative, and phenomenological means just understanding individuals' subjective states of mind. How do you understand coaching as an individual, or ethnographic perspectives? How do groups think of themselves and as they coach? It's more immersive participatory. It can be descriptive and explanatory, and I think that's an important part to this tradition, but as I've said, it tends to be more critical. It's trying to get people to think in different ways, to get them to change how they see things, and in getting people to think in different ways, that can seem to be a basis for change. So observations, what are its kind of main findings, if you like? If you look across the literature, it comes to this view that sport coaching is essentially social. It's not cognitive, it's not behavioural, it is social, it's about relationships. And in those relationships is a complexity, dynamism, a contingency, a contextual nature that really needs to be recognised. So they're less likely to generalise their findings, much more likely to talk about high performance, who I've not talked about so far, rugby, than they are about coaching in general. much more likely to talk about its contested and problematic nature, highlighting the problems, highlighting the tensions, the difficulties, and also I think a lot of positions do this, but say what is it that's underneath coaching that's driving these relationships, its hidden dimensions. In terms of coach learning and development, I think you'll recognise some of these things in terms of kind of changes in coach education, but they really have been a strong advocate of participation in actual practice and learning by doing, and understanding that you'll learn to coach by watching others, by engaging coaches, by talking to others. So that socialization experience. But that's a problem. That can be a problem if you're in an environment that has problems. So if you're learning to coach from individuals who don't know how to coach, then that becomes a problem. But the sociologists in the main, and it's not all the way across the board, would say, but you don't tell people that they're doing things wrong by giving them an alternative model like the behaviourists and the cognitivists would do. They'd say you've just got to get them to realise that there's a problem. And you do that through raising their social and political consciousness and criticality. So you give them tools, you give them theories, you say, think about coaching slightly different, think about its social dimensions, and then you might recognise there are problems here that you've got to address. So it gives people ideas that takes them only a certain way down the mountain. It takes them to the general level, but it doesn't really necessarily take them to the middle level, whereas this will work in this context kind of point of view. In terms of criticisms, as might be expected from people who do a lot of criticising, there's been a pushback from institutions, from psychologists, and indeed myself. Institutions, it's been very interesting over the years watching sociologists present to governing bodies. If the style is critical, then the style is rattling cages. If you're rattling the cage of someone who's been doing coach development in a governing body for 10 or 20 or 30 years, then they are obviously going to feel quite sensitive about someone rattling their cage. And I've seen it happen. And I've seen sociologists not be used so much as researchers because they've just rattled too many cages. And that might be sometimes an issue of presentation as it is a matter of substance. The psychologists and myself would probably have two counter critiques. The sociologists generally tend to misrepresent the positions of others, creating what's called a straw man. It's generally straw man. It's gendered in the way, or an Aunt Sally, so it's gendered both ways. But it's just saying, cognitivists are saying that research is really, really simple, and if you do these things, you do it well. But the cognitivists have never said those things, so their position has been unfairly characterised, and so I think that would probably be a counter critique. The other has probably been an overstatement of the case for the social. Of course, the social is important. An overstatement of the in complexity of coaching and how manageable it is. Of course, it's complex and of course difficult, but there are other things to it. There is the individual, there is the agency, there are behaviours, there are cognitions, and these need to be recognised. Like I said, it can become a bit of a hobby finding issues with the social position just because they pick a fight and you want to push back. And there's a lot more to say about that, but I will leave those two as the main positions. So if maybe I just, yeah, and I'm sorry, just to go full circle again, as I said with the other positions, but just because there's criticisms doesn't mean to say it isn't useful. And you know, as someone who's been surrounded by people who've worked a lot with a cognitive approach, and someone who's actually trying to develop a position that tried to bring all these things together, the more I do research, the more I'm convinced by the importance of the social dimensions and the relationship dimensions of coaching as being a real underlying factor in its effectiveness. So it's not a position to be discarded. You would say if you're looking at the sociological literature, just try and avoid some of it. Take its good bits and avoid some of its more spiky moments. So maybe I'll just do a very, very quick recap, Derek, and we can, and if there's anyone wants to continue on the conversation, they can. I've tried to make the point that there are different types of sport coaching knowledge, and that research is just one of those types, and they all do good work for us as coaches, coach developers, researchers. They all need to be recognised. I've tried to give you this analogy that for research, that you can think about it operating at lots of different levels, and the higher up you go, the more kind of insight it gives you to look further down. So you can use this kind of metaphor of the mountain, or the 4 levels of research, for placing the kind of research that you use. But there's also something else there about the way that you go up the levels of research is also an analogy for the way in which you can think about how you unpick the different levels of knowledge of a sport coach or as a coach developer. I've talked about the different perspectives, the main 3 perspectives on sport coaching. And I've asked the question, should we think of this as either or and both? And I guess what I'm trying to say to you is they all do good and less good work. They all have something to offer. And that you can use these different perspectives, these different ways of seeing sport coaching from a research perspective, but the other knowledge types as well, to start to interrogate your coach's knowledge through different layers of understanding, different levels. Through this idea of single loop, double loop, or triple loop, it's almost like an inversion of the mountain. The higher up you go the mountain, the more you go towards the double and the triple. And in effect, if you can see the mounting analogy at the top there, the top of the iceberg, the more you go up the mountain and the more you use these tools to unpack coaching, the more you see underneath coaching the layers of influence on decision making that underneath the surface, the more you see underneath the surface. Derek, I think I'm done. That was awfully rushed. I do apologise. I hope it was clear.
Yeah, from my perspective, it was pretty clear enough. I do thank you for keeping to time. I do appreciate it's 1 minute after 3:30, but those who wish to stay on the call, I would welcome them to do so if they've got any burning questions. But I suppose it leaves me just to ask the question, or perhaps it's just something I noticed that, and it's perhaps the reason why we invited you onto this call is recognizing where these differing perspectives converge rather than where do they diverge, is an important thing for me, and how cognitive approaches might help you to understand certain behaviors, like coaching behavior, and how coaching behavior might help you to understand certain cognitions. And I also respect the inclusion of social competence as something that might sit as a knowledge within one of the knowledges.
So, yeah.
And therefore how cognitive approaches and social approaches can work together to develop that, but also to understand that. So I suppose that's just an observation from my end, based on what you've just taken us through. Does anybody want to ask a question at this point? You're welcome to just jump in and do so.
While you're thinking, just to come back on that, I think you're absolutely right. I think all of the knowledge types help to frame each other. And if there was a pecking order, my temptation would be to say that it's the sociology offers us the starting point, the entry into all of this problem, because sociology is saying, think about the bigger picture, think about coaching as a social activity, a social endeavor, and then within that, understand what it is, understand the relationships, and then use that knowledge then to explore further into how individuals think about it and how they behave within that social environment. So if there's the social is always prior to the individual. We as individuals are always born into a world that exists before us, and that world always helps to shape the way that we are. And obviously, as educators, we try and shape that, but we want to use the knowledge types that are appropriate to the kind of questions we're asking. But I think we can't. The social knowledge is important.
Yeah, and I suppose in my listening to a podcast last night, which Stuart Wilkinson was a guest of with Daniel Abrahams, very much speaks to the social perspective, perhaps being the entry point, and linking back to just understanding the person in front of you, or meeting people where they are, and understanding how their history or their biography is affecting how they might be behaving in a certain context is crucially important. So I would welcome that note from yourself around sociology perhaps being a good starting point. Leslie, I'm going to invite you in to ask your question, if that's okay.
Hi, thanks Derek, and thanks Julian. I'm really curious to know why you think there's so little meta-theoretical research in the sports coaching area, if you have a reason or a few reasons for that.
Yeah, there is I think there are a few reasons. I think it relates to the evolution of science in sports science disciplines. So I think the position that frames behavioural approaches, which is a position called positivism, which some of you may have heard of, which is just basically thinks that we can understand the world through splitting up into smaller parts and measuring the relationship between those parts. Sports scientists will recognise conceptualising things and measuring the relationship between them as being an important part of what they do. But that model of science was really the model of science that the sports scientists adopted, and they adopted it from their parent disciplines, psychology and so on and so forth. So if kind of like sports science has generally been dominated by particular parent disciplines and particular ways of doing science, and there's no need so much to think about those higher level questions because you've already got those questions answered for you. You don't need to think about them. But of course, that particular view of science has created all kinds of problems as it's evolved, and then so people are saying, well, this view of the findings that we get from this research doesn't feel like our kind of day-to-day understandings of what coaching is like. So they start to ask questions about that model of science. But if you start asking questions about models of science, of course, you have to move up the mountain. So I think it wasn't there to start with because of our history. And I think that still is prevalent in a lot of sports schools and universities across the UK and in the US and English-speaking countries. There is a real reluctance for people trained in particular disciplines to move out of their disciplinary area. Disciplines have a real kind of controlling force on that, controlling influence on academic researchers. I wasn't a sports scientist. My background is actually in economics, so I had no sports science baggage with me when I came into the sporting area. So it was easy for me to get rid of my disciplines. And so I think that's another reason. I just think it's also people aren't so interested in reading about philosophy. I know, Leslie, you have an interest in it, but it's not everyone's cup of tea, shall we say. It is more abstract. By moving up that mountain, it does become more abstract, and a lot of people prefer to stay in the valley floor. It's comfortable. If we had more time to talk about the cognitive position, that's exactly what they say, is that people don't like to move out of their intuitive, naturalistic comfort zones. They don't like to. There's a cognitive influence against expanding your mindset. If you like, people don't like to learn. People don't like to change their minds. it's a massive generalisation, of course, because there are people who do, clearly going back to Stuart's point about individual difference. But there are kind of cognitive influences that emphasise the valley floor.
Thanks.
Thanks, Leslie. I suppose the question that's popping into mind is, we are coach developers and you are research, or Jay, and we're having this conversation. How useful would a conversation of this nature be for coaches on the ground? Do they need to know that these types of conversations are happening, or does it really matter to them at all?
Well, I would say not to start with, no. It depends on what your understanding of what effective coach development is, but I guess I would share a view recently shared by the program up in Scotland, the High Performance Coach Developer Program, that you, as a coach developer, you're just starting to ask questions and trying to understand coaches. But of course, those questions are informed by different ideas. You ask questions because you, as a coach developer, have hopefully a broader understanding, more experience of coaching that you can ask those questions from. And so a simple question might be, so, tell me, as a coach, tell me what you think effective coaching looks like. And actually that's a question that many coaches really, really struggle to answer. But it might be, tell me what you do in a session, or what do you emphasize? And that the answer might be, well, I just like to try and make sure everyone's busy and sessions start and finish on time, beginning of the community level. But you might say, well, what about, what's your relationship with your athletes like, and what's your relationship with your coach manager like, and how does that influence what you do? And so the questions, I think in terms of the coach development process, often remain hidden, and probably that's for the best. Until somebody is so triggered by the questions that you're asking, you say, hang on a minute, where are all these questions coming from? And that probably then is a time to say, well, actually, there's some things you could read.
Yeah, it's interesting. I lean back to Andy's paper. I think it's of vampires and werewolves, and just considering, as we move away from dualism, so there is a right and wrong way of coaching, and more towards appreciating that perhaps all knowledges or all approaches to sports coaching may have equal value relative to the person you're working with or the context you're working in. And I'm guessing as you enter into the fog, that is perhaps the right time to then begin to have these conversations. And if I go back to my original question around considering these approaches and the coach's journey from naive to sophisticated, where might we then start dialing up or dialing down our use of these approaches around how we might inform coach education?
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, it's the questions like, how well do you know the coach, and how good is your relationship? Are probably as equally important questions to where are they in terms of where are they on the novice expert continuum.
Back into sociology.
Sorry?
You're back into sociology.
Well, I can't help it. I said before that they're slowly seducing me. But I'm working with a coach at the moment, a high performance coach, really intensively, and I wouldn't dream at the moment of talking about some of the things I've talked about today. But all of my questions to him are informed by all of these ideas, of course. But then when you see something, it's always that move in any area of activity from the general to the specific you ask the general questions, and you work out where people are situated, and then you start to drill down a little bit more through questioning to those areas. But whether you share stuff, I think depends on your reading of that individual and whether they're ready. And of course, I think a point, again, going back to this idea of language and trying to find out about each other, I think academics have a responsibility which they're not fulfilling at the moment to try and make their ideas as simple as possible and translate them into ways that it doesn't involve in reading an academic article that's got 10 pages of methods. I mean, that might feel pretty rich coming from me after using the language after the for the last 1.5 hours, but yeah.
No, and I could have that argument after citing one of your papers in a recent project that I did as well, where I had to read perhaps nearly 10 pages of methods. But I was going to sorry, somebody else has got a question, and I'm going to invite them in. Oh, I was just going to make the point that we're way past time, but I think the marker of a good session is the fact that most guests have stayed on. What I won't do at this point is do a full summary, and we'll save that until the end of the session on Friday. But it just leaves me to thank you, Jay, for putting together a fairly comprehensive session that you got through relatively quickly. But if anybody has any burning questions, then I would just encourage you all just to offer them up via email between now and Friday, and we can perhaps address them just before we get into the meat of the session. Then, have you got any parting gifts for us, Jay? Or?
Yeah. So I think it's understandable that that there aren't lots of questions given the format, and also given the nature of the material. It is quite abstract. It's quite difficult to apply. So I don't take it personally, and hope you've all got something out of it. And I think probably just the next thing to say really is just moving on to that next slide is that the next time is about trying to put those pieces back together again to show how they can link together into a model of understanding coaching practice and effective coaching where all the bits are together. And that might be a useful tool for you as coach developers. I certainly hope so.
Thanks very much, Jay. I don't know whether or not you want to stay on for a quick 2-minute debrief, but at this point, everybody else is welcome to leave should they wish. How's that cup of tea? Is it still warm?
No. Second law of thermodynamics has got its teeth into it, I'm afraid.
Oh dear.
It's freezing.
I think there's just colleagues left on the call, which